There is something deeply unsettling about standing next to a 19th century railway structure and realizing that, even today, with all our machines, cranes and precision engineering, we would struggle to replicate it with the same scale, the same density, and the same apparent excess of material, as if whoever built it was not constrained by the same limitations we quietly accept as normal. At first glance, railways from the 1800s are usually presented as triumphs of early industrial ingenuity, symbols of progress driven by steam power and human determination. Yet, when you begin to look closer, not through the lens of textbooks but through raw visual comparison, something starts to feel off in a way that is difficult to ignore. Massive stone bridges composed of blocks so large and so precisely fitted that even modern restoration teams often avoid dismantling them. Tunnels carved through mountains with a consistency that suggests not trial and error but overwhelming capability, and retaining walls that seem built not for trains of that era, but for forces far greater than anything they would realistically need to support. All begin to form a pattern that does not sit comfortably within the narrative we have been given. If you take a moment to isolate the human figures in historical photographs, placing them against these colossal constructions, the contrast becomes almost absurd, because the workers appear less like builders and more like incidental details within a project whose proportions suggest something far beyond manual labor as we understand it. The official explanation tells us that thousands of workers, basic tools, and sheer persistence made all of this possible, but when you start asking how long it would take, how materials were transported, how precision was achieved without modern measurement systems, and how such consistency was maintained across vast distances, the answers begin to stretch thin, relying more on assumption than on clearly documented processes. Once you start noticing that something feels off about the scale of these railway structures, the mind naturally begins to search for an explanation that matches what the eyes are seeing. Because throughout history, whenever constructions appear too large, too heavy, or too precise for the people officially credited with building them, a different kind of idea tends to emerge, not as a definitive answer, but as a recurring possibility that shows up again and again across cultures and time. That idea is the existence of giants, not in a symbolic or exaggerated sense, but as physical beings described in ancient texts, folklore, and early historical accounts as larger and stronger than ordinary humans, often associated with the movement of massive stones and the construction of structures that later generations struggled to explain, which is why many of these accounts were gradually pushed into the category of myth, even though the descriptions themselves remained surprisingly consistent across different parts of the world. And what makes this even more interesting is not just the stories on their own, but the pattern they form when you compare them. Because from Europe to the Americas, from Asia to the Middle East, there are repeated references to oversized beings connected to building, shaping landscapes and handling materials that would be extremely difficult for normal humans to manage. And while each culture has its own version, the core idea remains very similar, as if these were not isolated inventions, but echoes of something that was once widely known or observed. Now, bringing this back to the railways, the question is not about proving that giants existed, but about understanding why the scale of certain constructions seems to align more closely with what those descriptions suggest than with what we would expect from human limitations at the time, because when you look at massive stone supports, oversized tunnels, and structures built with an apparent disregard for material economy, it starts to feel less like careful engineering under constraints and more like construction carried out with capabilities that did not require minimizing effort or resources. So even if the idea of giants feels uncomfortable or easy to dismiss at first, it introduces a perspective that changes how these structures are seen. Because instead of asking how humans managed to build something so large with limited tools, you begin to ask whether the scale itself is telling a different story, one that may have been simplified, forgotten, or deliberately reinterpreted over time. And once that perspective is in place, what used to seem like isolated curiosities begins to connect, forming a pattern that is much harder to ignore the longer you look at it. Now that the idea has been placed on the table, even if only as a possibility, the next step is not to jump to conclusions, but to examine something much more grounded and difficult to argue with, which is logistics. Because regardless of who built these structures, human or otherwise, the process of moving materials, organizing labor, and executing construction at this scale follows physical rules that cannot be ignored. When you look at 19th century railways, especially those that cut through mountains, cross deep valleys, or rely on massive stone supports, you are not just looking at isolated structures, but at entire systems built across long distances, often in difficult terrain, where every single block of stone had to be extracted, shaped, transported, and precisely positioned. Not once, but thousands of times in a continuous and coordinated effort. And this is where the explanation starts to become strained, because the traditional narrative leans heavily on the idea of large numbers of workers using basic tools. But when you begin to break that down in practical terms, questions quickly multiply. Because moving extremely heavy stone without modern machinery is not just slow. It is unpredictable, difficult to control, and highly dependent on conditions like terrain, weather, and available infrastructure, which in many of these locations was either limited or completely absent at the time. So how do you maintain precision under those conditions? Not just occasionally, but consistently across entire railway lines that stretch for miles, where bridges align perfectly with tracks, tunnels meet with minimal deviation, and structural elements show a level of uniformity that suggests planning and execution at a very high level. Because it is one thing to build something large with enough time and labor, but it is something entirely different to build something large, precise, and consistent, especially when the tools available should, in theory, introduce far more variation and error than what we actually observe. And this is where the scale problem becomes a logistics problem, because the question is no longer just about strength or size, but about coordination, control, and repeatability, all of which require systems, methods, or capabilities that go beyond what is usually described in simplified historical explanations. So again, we arrive at the same tension, not as a conclusion, but as a growing gap between what we are told and what we can reasonably reconstruct. Because if the logistics do not fully add up, then either the process was far more advanced than commonly explained, or we are still missing a critical part of the story that has yet to be properly understood. At his point, the biggest question may not be whether giants existed in the literal sense, but whether these railway structures were truly designed around normal human limitations. Because once you look carefully at the size of the embankments, the width of certain cuts through rock, the mass of the bridges, and the sheer amount of stone used in places where lighter solutions might have worked, it starts to feel as though the builders were operating with a completely different sense of what was practical, necessary, or even excessive. This is where the subject becomes especially interesting, because the official explanation usually frames all of this as a product of ambition, national expansion, industrial confidence, and a willingness to overbuild for durability. And while that may explain part of the picture, it still leaves an uncomfortable gap. since overbuilding on this level is not just a matter of vision, but of labor, transport, extraction, coordination, and cost, all multiplied across enormous distances, in conditions that should have made efficiency more important, not less. And yet, what we often see is the opposite of efficiency in the modern sense, because many of these structures appear to have been built with astonishing abundance. As if weight was not a serious problem, as if moving huge quantities of stone was not a major obstacle, and as if the builders had access to a level of physical capability that made such decisions feel normal rather than extreme. That does not automatically prove the presence of giants, but it does keep the idea alive in a way that is difficult to dismiss. Because if a structure repeatedly looks too large for the needs it supposedly served, and too massive for the methods we are told were used, then the scale itself begins to act like evidence of a missing context, whether that missing context involves forgotten techniques, a lost workforce with unusual physical ability, or something even more controversial that history no longer knows how to describe. And this is why the giant theory continues to hold power in the public imagination, not simply because people enjoy strange ideas, but because the visible proportions of these constructions keep pushing the mind toward a builder that fits the build, a workforce that fits the weight, and a physical presence that better matches the world these structures seem to belong to. After everything we've seen, the massive structures, the precision in difficult conditions, the overwhelming use of material, and the constant mismatch between what is explained and what is visible, the most uncomfortable possibility may not be that giants built the railways, but that we have been asking the wrong question from the very beginning. Because the moment we assume that these structures were built exactly as described by people with the limitations we recognize today, we are forced to stretch every explanation to its limit, filling gaps with assumptions, simplifying processes that should be extremely complex, and accepting that something this consistent could emerge from methods that, in any practical reconstruction, would struggle to achieve the same result. But what if the real issue is not how they were built, but how much of the original context has been lost, simplified, or reinterpreted over time? Because history does not always preserve processes with perfect accuracy, especially when those processes no longer fit the framework of what later generations consider normal or possible. And this is where the scale becomes more than just a detail, it becomes a clue. Not proof of giants in the literal sense, but evidence that the builders, whoever they were, operated under conditions, capabilities, or knowledge that do not fully align with the version of the past we have inherited. Which means that instead of forcing the structures to fit the story, we might need to consider the possibility that the story itself has been reduced to fit what we are comfortable accepting. Because when you look at these railways without the filter of assumption, when you allow the size, the weight, and the precision to speak for themselves, a different interpretation begins to form. One that does not rely on fantasy but on observation, and that quietly suggests that something about this chapter of history remains unresolved. And maybe that is the real reason why the idea of giants refuses to disappear, not because it has been proven, but because the world we can still see, built in stone and scale, continues to hint that whatever the full truth is, it might be larger than the explanation we have been given.